Hello, thank you very much. That was really interesting. My name is Jan Petrowski. I'm The Economist's business editor. And now I'm here with Robin Kieran from Interos to offer another perspective on all things supply chain. Grab a seat, Robin. This is meant to be a fireside chat. I was telling Robin, who's based in Florida, the only time that I've seen a fireside chat done by a fire was in Miami, of all places. Which makes absolutely no sense, but there you go. No fire today, but the conversation I'm sure will be really interesting. Why don't we start by just you giving us a bit of a sense of what Interos does, because it might not be a company that many of our listeners are familiar with.
Sure. Using artificial intelligence and machine learning, we map, we monitor, we model the world's supply chains. Map means we discover relationships between companies, between suppliers. Not just the supplier that you have, but the suppliers that they work with and so on and so forth, down to end tiers. We monitor for events that might occur that create risk, and we model. So whereas monitoring is what's just happened, you need to do something about it and react. Modeling allows you to have a little sense of what might come. Financial erosion, ESG change, reputational risk, operational risk, geopolitical risk, ESG, and of course, quite topical, sanctions.
Right, so that gives you an incredible vantage point to try and answer the first of my questions. So ever since the pandemic, even before the pandemic, but certainly in the early days of the pandemic, sort of April, May 2020, and then again in the autumn of last year, there was an awful lot of panic in C-suites around the world about supply chains. And as a result, also an awful lot of talk about, just forgetting this whole globalization business. We need to bring production back home, nearshoring, or if not at home, then close by. Politicians, leapt onto the same sort of rhetoric. But you heard it from company bosses, you heard it from political leaders. It seemed to be sort of certainly in the air. I'm wondering, so 2 years into this situation, from your vantage point, are we actually seeing any of this happening, or was it mostly all talk?
So we just conducted a survey of roughly 1,500 global 5,000 companies, and the facts would say that at the moment it's planning to do something, but the actual reshoring or nearshoring or deploying China plus one strategies is not yet being deployed. So roughly 50% of companies said that they were planning to take actions like that, and they are in the planning phase. But we haven't yet seen that.
But and is there any indication that the sort of, the capital investment plans are actually reflecting this intent, or not quite yet?
Again, not quite yet. What we are seeing, though, is a commitment to spend on technology that will alleviate some of the essential problems that do exist in the supply chain across 4 areas. I can speak to each 4 of those, but we see a commitment to invest in technology in order to alleviate challenges in the supply.
So give us a sense of what sort of technology and
Sure.
And maybe who's doing the spending as well, whether maybe there are any particular sectors, industries, which are keener to get on board than others.
Yeah, so number 1, automation, global labor shortage, do more with less, workflow, ServiceNow, UiPath, RPAs, Coupa, those sorts of investments, doing more with less. In fact, Lexmark, I think, just gave a great example of using automation to avoid problems and do more with less. Transportation, companies like Flexport that provide efficiency in assembling at ports so that there aren't empty containers, and LTL is a thing of the past. Transparency into the supply chain, so you can see and anticipate problems. That's where Interos comes in, and that's where we really focus. And 4th, more collaboration. So why would everybody send a survey to a supplier when actually you could share it amongst a consistent, let's say, oil and gas sector and share that information? Companies like Achilles provide those sorts of buyer networks. Broadly, they're the 4 areas we see.
So let's focus on yours then. I mean, which is the one that you obviously have most insight into. Why are companies suddenly sort of so desperate to understand the intricacies of the exact, precise waft and warp of their supply chains?
Yeah, and I think there's a few very obvious things like, as we've seen over the past 2 years, concentration risk that drives shortage, sanctions that drive simply there isn't enough nickel, there isn't enough quality grade material to fulfill your supply chain. Supplies are constrained, they can't overnight develop new facilities. You can't switch a supplier. You may plan to over time.
So actually, the concentration risk is the one that I've been thinking about a lot. So there's a lot of talk by many companies of multiple sourcing, so bringing more resilience into your more redundancy into your operations. And there's a sort of, the moment you start thinking about it, there's a little bit of a problem, because basically, if everybody's thinking the same, and everybody is suddenly multiple sourcing, but you haven't actually increased the underlying supply base, because you can't do that. Unlike signing contracts, you can't build extra supply capacity overnight. Then you're not really becoming more resilient. Certainly in the aggregate, the global economy isn't becoming more resilient.
In the aggregate, yes, but you can have a first mover advantage.
So tell us about that first mover advantage. How does that work?
Right, so if you know that your supplier is reliant upon these 3 suppliers, and they may be reliant upon somebody that actually is supplying all 4 or 5 of those, you've got a problem. And if you can see that problem now, before your competition sees that there's constraint in the supply chain, you can take an action. Right? You can look for alternative sources of suppliers, or you can contract directly with that 4th party or 2nd or 3rd tier supplier. So in aggregate, there may not be any more carbon dioxide available, but you can get there first if you have visibility into the depths of your supply chain.
So are you seeing any actual evidence of more supply coming online, as well as just more multiple sourcing contracts being signed?
I don't think we have evidence of more supply yet. But again, this is hard. This is something that might take years to design and build. So we're not expecting capacity to suddenly increase. And with a potentially looming recession, we're not sure that that's where money's being spent. The evidence in the survey would say that instead, that money is being spent in technology that allows companies to be more efficient in their supply chain.
So, okay, so concentration. So there's a famous example of a concentrated supply chain is semiconductors, where you basically have, it's like a long string of pinch points, from the sort of almost from the raw material all the way to the produced microprocessor. Famously, ASML, the Dutch company, basically makes it's the only company to make the lithography machines needed to etch the most advanced cutting-edge semiconductors. And then the bulk of those is made by TSMC, with some made in Taiwan, with some made by Samsung. So it's a very, very concentrated supply chain, and and obviously it maybe certainly didn't grind to a halt, but it presented problems to a lot of customers, especially to car makers, it seems, because their relations with the suppliers were not quite as close, and as a result, they ended up at the back of the line when supplies suddenly became constrained. So that's a famous one. What other industries are you, through your visibility tools, seeing similar, maybe not as extreme, but sort of similar signs of concentration third in the sort of lower tiers of suppliers that might not be evident to the companies, the big brand names at the top of the value chain?
So we have a map that actually visualizes that concentration. If you look for semiconductor manufacturing, there's a whole concentration,
blinking
just
red.
one part of the world. Yeah, but we do see industries, life sciences, pharmaceutical manufacturers, chemical producers that have suppliers down in their supply chain that show similar signs of concentration and therefore imminent risk. Aerospace and defence would also, with some raw materials and metals that are quite precious within their supply chains.
And is that sort of concentrated geographically? Is it concentrated just because there is a monopoly supplier of a certain crucial ingredient? How does that work?
And it can be both, and commonly it is geographically, because the underlying raw material, the mine that produces that, is typically in a geographic concentration.
Right. And so, okay, so we have this situation when a lot of companies realize that the way that they have been doing things is perhaps a little bit riskier than they thought. They're thinking about doing things differently to the way that they had been doing them. And the words they use to describe this phenomenon is resilience or redundancy. And that's a very nice word, and it's nice and fuzzy. the word that comes to my mind immediately whenever I hear those words is insurance. And the moment I think about insurance, I think about how much the policy costs, because insurance isn't free. So introducing resilience or redundancy into your supply chain necessarily means some form of a cost. It might be cost worth bearing, just as many people decide to buy insurance, but it is a cost, certainly in the short run. And someone is going to have to bear it. And the way I see it, there's sort of three buckets of possible payers. One is consumers through higher prices. One is taxpayers through some sort of a subsidy that would offset the extra cost. And one is companies through lower margins. I don't think there is anything else, any other source that you can sort of come up with as to who bears the cost. So do you have a sense of who is going to bear that cost?
Subsidies are short term, so that's not a long-term solution. Consumers coming into a recession will have an appetite for a certain period of time. We certainly have visibility into it's okay now to pass the cost on to the consumer, but 1 year from now, I don't think anyone can take that for granted. So therefore, it's margin. So being efficient is the way to preserve margin, hence the investment in technologies that I referred to earlier on.
So give us a little bit more of a sense of the sort of investments in technology that you're seeing companies, maybe a little bit more granularity on the sort of investments that you're seeing both your customers making from you, basically, what sort of services they're buying from you, more precisely, and also maybe what else they're doing on top of the services you provide.
I can certainly speak to us more, and it's not just because we want to do the right thing or even the financial driver of making those changes, but there's an increasing regulatory pressure of countries deciding whether it's the German Supply Chain Act, whether it's DORA that impacts financial services across Europe, whether it's the New York Fashion Act, and I could go on for another probably 50, which now mandates visibility into and responsibility for not just your supplier, but your supplier's supplier and down in the food chain. So the ability you can't protect and say, I didn't know that my supplier's supplier was using slave labor, was using oil flaring, was using things that would be both a reputational risk if discovered now, and it's been on the front page of The Economist, I'm sure, and other articles that embarrass companies when it's discovered. Now, regulations are making that something it's unavoidable.
So how do you gain insight into those very intricate supply chains, and how do you tease out the information that's relevant to your customers? I mean, how much of it is sort of public information? How much of it is proprietary information? So where do you get your data to shed light on those supply chains?
Good question, and we ingest an enormous quantity of data. We buy a great deal of data commercially available.
From who?
From dozens of sources. Just imagine companies that sell financial data. Imagine companies that provide ESG data. So we buy that, but even more so, again, using artificial intelligence, machine learning, we're looking at open source information around the world 24/7 that gives us the clues that inform the risks that our clients can use to see, and in some cases, and predict is a bit too strong, anticipate and plan around by having insights into the posture of, let's say, ESG, a company that's a supplier of my supplier that I didn't know. But now with Interos, now I do have visibility into my third, fourth, fifth parties, and therefore I can make the right decision to say, I can't condone that behavior, I will find an alternative supplier before I'm mandated to do so.
So what sort of, on open source data, I mean, is it sort of aerial photographs and satellite imagery from Google Maps? Is it, I mean, is it press articles from local media? Give us a bit of a flavor of what it is that your algorithm crunches.
Absolutely all of the above, and authoritative journals and reputable newspapers for sure. It overlaid with Google Maps so that you know where your locations are that will be most impacted, weather forecasts, social but authoritative social. LinkedIn would be a good example. Job postings, import-export data for movements of goods. I mean, literally thousands of sources where we are scouring for information that's then corroborated, of course. What used to be done by humans in Interos is now being done by machine learning algorithms, so we've transferred that over the years to now automate that process. Humans are still involved to make sure that the accuracy and the fidelity of that information stands up to the tests so that it is authoritative enough to infer the risk.
And are your customers very surprised by what you find?
Shocked often. I won't say who, but there have been some conversations where we show, did you know that your supplier is doing business with this supplier that's on the sanctions list? Or did you know, and there's been a couple of times where people, I can't see that yet. So yes, often people are surprised. More often people are happy because now they can do something about it.
So are there any particular, I mean, you probably cannot speak to specific companies, but any particular sectors where this is sort of most problematic, or where you've seen most problems of this particular sort?
I just put it in two categories. You've got physical supply chains, you've got digital supply chains, and I did mention earlier on, it's July the 4th coming up, so inevitably there will be some sort of a cyber event happening between now and Tuesday, because the bad actors love to disrupt people's weekends. So there's most likely.
Was that the case before, like the Memorial Day weekend?
Every holiday weekend in the US, something. So digital supply chains and the ability to see, and financial services companies, of course, don't move physical goods, but they do rely upon technology. They do rely upon the technology that's often embedded in the technology, that they go to great lengths to ensure that that product is good, but embedded technology within that is now a step removed, and often a step removed, and open source data and open source language code is included in that. So do you really know what's in those applications? And the ability to understand and track back to that fifth party is pretty important.
And so that's the digital. And on the physical side? So are there any particular sectors where you have when you think you have a particular exposure to these potential,
So aerospace and defence would probably be top of list for us. Huh. And that speaks a little bit to the legacy of Interos as a company, because for the first 17 years, we were focused, 14 years, we're resolutely focused on serving the needs of the US government and companies that support the US government. So aerospace and defence, we have a particular depth, but that quickly spreads into Federal Reserve banking system goes to financial services, banks, insurance. Aerospace and defence is discrete manufacturing, which is not a big leap away from a combination of high-tech and the chip problem that you're speaking to, as well as automotive and other discrete processes, and then flows down into manufacturing.
So, we have a couple of minutes left, so I wanted to ask you how do you expect, we went quite granular, but to step back now and sort of wonder, how different will global supply chains be sort of 5 years from now? So, after those plans that your survey is demonstrating maybe start materializing, relative to what we had in 2019.
So I think the three factors there are going to be, yes, those plans will start to come to life, whether it's nearshoring, reshoring, China plus one. I think we will begin to see that relatively quickly. The regulations, undoubtedly, there's no choice. Those regulations will have impact, and therefore companies need to have visibility into being able to comply with those regulations. And the third one just escaped me.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fascinating subject, because the system that was in place until 2019, I mean, still is, was just so incredibly efficient, and obviously had its problems, but also seemed to be relatively resilient, for all the problems that we've seen in the past couple of years, including in the chip industry and obviously the snags at ports and stuff and such like, it seems to have held up. I mean, given the scale of the disruption, it seems to have held up remarkably well. So I mean, I'm almost minded to make a prediction that things in 5 years' time won't look all that different. I mean, they'll be different on the margin, and there will be a slight difference in emphasis. But I really struggle to see how it will be. It doesn't seem like an overhaul is in the works.
I think recession may aid your prediction in that demand may reduce somewhat. We use the phrase supply chain washing. So previously being able to say that's not me because I'm not directly dealing with that supplier by pushing it further down into the supply chain, that's not going to be allowed.
Yeah.
Money laundering's had regulations, and now we believe there is evidence of similar legislation coming into the supply chain. So will it look different? I believe that there will be differences. Let's go 5 years from now and see what that ends up being.
Well, let's meet maybe in 5 years' time and reassess. Thank you so much. We've run out of time. This was really interesting. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And thank you, Robin.
Thank you, Jan. Pleasure.